Are you tired of having to track promises using useState and useEffect? There's got to be a better way. And now there is. The React team has come out with an RFC that gives first-class support to promises in the React ecosystem. Now, you'll just be able to define your promises almost anywhere and then use them directly in your components. Has writing get server-side props on the server side got you down? Well, this RFC's got you covered. You'll just be able to convert your components into async components and then just await your data and render it. Obviously, the React community is excited about this.
Let's go, boy! Yeah!
And honestly, I'm excited too. I think this is a fantastic addition to React, but there are some footguns. For example, if you use fetch in this use just like this, you will get an infinite white screen of death. So to learn more about why that is and learn about an even bigger architectural footgun, follow me past the spiffy logo intro. Let's get right into it. So of course, there's a link to the RFC in the description down below. But basically the idea is this. We want to have promises as first-class citizens in the React ecosystem. And as with many things in React, it basically comes down to two different implementations, one for the client and one for the server. So the way I'm going to structure the content here is we're going to go over the client side first, then we're going to go over what is there when it comes to the server, and then I'm going to talk about that big architectural gotcha that can come along with using this at a large scale. All right, let's get right into the client side of things. So you can actually try this out today. And what we're going to do to test that is I'm going to do a Vite app. So yarn create Vite. And we'll call this use test. And then I'll use a template of React. So far, so good. So let me bring that up in VS Code. All right, so out of the box, our package.json is going to be on 18.2 of React. And to try this out, we need to move it on to the experimental branch. So all you need to do is just change these two to experimental. And then do your yarn or npm install if you prefer. And now let's bring that up using yarn dev. And there we go. Awesome. And it works just like you'd expect. Cool. So now what we can do is we can start playing around with use. So if I go over here to app.jsx, let's just pull out most of the content. Now to bring in this new use, you actually bring it in as experimental use, which most folks then just coerce to use. So now I've got use. Cool. So use is really conceptually just use promise. I did a video a couple of months ago on 5 different uses for React Query and SWR, where I showed that those hooks are basically also kind of a wrapper around promises. You can use them for doing all kinds of different promises. So I want to start out by, instead of doing fetch, I want to go and start out using GPS, because GPS isn't a promise. So we're going to coerce it into a promise and then use to observe that promise. And the idea here is just to show you that you can use this use promise for any type of promise. So the first thing we need to do is create a promise for getting the GPS. So I'll call that get GPS. And we'll create a new promise, which will get a resolve. And then within that, I'm going to get the current position and resolve it. But I don't want to just resolve it like that. I'm actually going to break it out into its parts and pieces. All right, so this is a promise that's currently getting our GPS, but nobody's listening. So we're going to create a GPS component that does the listening. So now we do use and get GPS. And the output of that is just our data. And now let's stringify it. Cool. Okay, let's drop it into our app and see if it works. So will we allow it? Yep, we will. All right, so it looks like we're getting our GPS, but we haven't wrapped our GPS component in a suspense. Now, there is some talk in the RFC about you not having to do this once it's actually released, but for the moment, you have to wrap this in a suspense. So let's do that. And there you have it. The latitude and longitude of Tokyo, which is where I've currently set my browser to. Nice. So now you can see that this use is useful for any type of promise you have, not just fetch. Okay, so let's go and take this and put this into a different file. Now we're going to kind of get into the world of fetch because I think that's what everybody's here for. So let's go and make this gps.jsx and then export that GPS. And let's remove this suspense. So of course, all of this code is available to you in the link down below in the description. While you're there, of course, you can hit that like button and that subscribe button. But of course, I think why the folks are here is to learn about fetching. So let's go and make some data that is worth fetching. So I'm going to go over here into our public and create some data. So the first file we're going to create is called ids.json. And it's going to have a list of subsequent files that we can go and fetch and get data from. So it's going to be just a list of those IDs. I'll just have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then let's make the first one 1.json. And in that, we'll have an ID and a name. Awesome. So now let's go make 2, 3, and 4. Cool. Now we got all our data. So let's start playing around with this. First, we want to go and get that ids.json, right? So let's go and make a names component. It's going to display a list of names from that JSON. So the first thing we're going to try is use, and then we'll just fetch it. And of course, we need to get the JSON out of that. So let's do that. And that's going to give us our list of IDs. And we'll just stringify that. All right, let's put it in our code. All right, so what we can see, now we're just continuously getting IDs over and over and over again. So before we talk about why we're going to do that, let me go and save my browser by just commenting this out. Okay, so what's happening here is an issue around references. So we first call names. Names, in turn, the first thing it does is call this fetch. That fetch starts, it returns a new reference to a new promise. That goes off to use. That puts essentially a then on it, waiting for that to complete. That's going to give us back our IDs. So currently this is just null, and it comes through here, and we just stringify null. So this fetch finally resolves, then use triggers. It then sets something internally that will give us back our IDs. That's going to force a re-render of this component. So then we then re-render, which again creates a new promise and a new reference to that promise, which use sees as a new fetch, a new promise to watch. And so that's why it's getting into this continuous loop. If you're a longtime viewer of this channel, you'll know about references when it comes to JavaScript and React and how important they are. References when it comes to JavaScript and React are everything. So you just got to make sure that you monitor those references. So how do we stabilize this reference? Because we really only want to do this fetch once. We can try a bunch of things with use memo and use ref, but the thing that I found that was most reliable was just to pull it out of the component completely. So let's call this IDs fetch and then make it. And now we can bring back names. And we've got our data, which is super smooth. I gotta say, I mean, this is really nice once you get it stabilized. It's a really nice API. So it's an awesome addition as a hook to the React ecosystem. And by the way, there's some talk also in the RFC around this being the first hook that will be conditionally usable, meaning that you could use it inside an if or after an if. That's really cool, actually. I mean, I can imagine a whole kind of cascade of uses. So this is a really nice addition to our toolkit of hooks. We've known we wanted a use promise for a long time, and here it is. So a question that's going to come up when it comes to use is whether you still need something like React Query or SWR now that we have this promise observing mechanism baked right into React. I still think you do, because I think both of those libraries add a lot of additional value, in particular things like refetching on an interval, which is not going to be something that's baked in here, nor is there going to be any information about the status coming back from this fetch. So actually, let's go and upgrade this fetch at least a little bit to make sure that we're doing it and getting enough data out of it to create a system that will respond when you get a bad status or something like that. So it's not just always the happy path. So the way we do that is we go and upgrade this then here to return that status. So we'll do status and give it the response status. And then also the data if it's a 200. Of course, this is a promise all on its own, so we should await that. And this will turn that into an async function. All right, let's take a look. And nice. Okay, so now we had like a 404 or something like that. At least we would get that. And we should also probably manage catch as well. But this is a good first start at least a fetch that's going to give you some status back as to whether it failed or worked. Okay, so let's go drill into this example a little bit more. I want to have like a detail selector here. So I'm going to go and take these IDs and turn them into buttons. And you click on the button and it'll load that particular piece of data. So let me first do that. All right, cool. So we got our buttons. So we need to hold which one we clicked. So we'll do use state for that. And then when we click on this, we'll set that selected. And now if we have a selected, we want to show it. So we need to have something that's going to show our information about this guy. So we'll call that detail. And it'll take an ID. And let's just return that ID for the moment. And we will say, if we have a selected, then show that detail. Okay, good. Actually, let's get rid of the GPS. Don't need that anymore. Okay, cool. So that makes more sense. All right, looking good. So in detail, we have this ID, and we want to use, right? Because this is a cool new thing. But how are we going to do that? Since we know that using that fetch right inside of detail wasn't going to work, but we need to have a fetch that's specific to a particular ID. So what I'm going to do instead of doing that is to create like a cached fetch. And that's going to, given a URL, return me a promise to get that data. But that promise reference is going to be stabilized. So if I request the same URL over and over and over again, I'll get the same promise back over and over and over again, because that's going to make use work. So let's build that. So I'll create our list of cached fetches, and then I'll create a cached fetch function. It will take a URL and look to see if it's in the cache already. And if it isn't, then we'll make that fetch. And then you know what? We use this code up here to do kind of a better fetch response. And then we'll just return that cached fetch. Cool. All right. So let's go down here and let's use it. So let's see. If I do data, and I'll put in there cached fetch, and I'll give it the URL, id.json. All right, let's see what we get back. I'm just going to JSON stringify that data. All right, here we go. Hey, that is really cool. Nice. And it's actually caching for us. So if I do network again, we can see that as I click along, we're not actually doing another load of any of that data. We're just going and getting the cache results that I had from before. So kind of a nice twofer there. Awesome. All right, so that's about as much as I want to cover on the client side of the house. We've talked about how to use on things that aren't fetch. We've talked about how to use with a fetch, why you don't use a fetch within the use, why you pull it out, how to do cached fetching, how to do fetching of different data like we have in this detail. It's a nice way. So hopefully this code will help you as you explore use in this new RFC. Again, of course, all this code is available to you on GitHub for free in a link in the description down below. And now on to the server. All right, so this is gonna be kind of a short segment when it comes to this RFC, when it comes to the server, and that's because as far as I know, there is no reference implementation at this time of this RFC in a server context. Now, the idea is fairly simple. If you're doing something like React server components, then you would have the ability to do an async component. So here is a next app that does something similar to what we had before. So if I look at the page, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 in it, and that's because we are getting IDs.json, which is the same thing we had in the client-side example. We're doing that in the get server-side props, And then we're passing it through using IDs down into the app down here. And that's why you get 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the idea is that with React Server Components, after this RFC, you won't have to do this at all. In fact, what you can do down here is you can just have this as an async function. And then you take this fetch and await it. And that's it. That's all you need to do when it comes to fetching off the server. But of course, I can't demonstrate that right now since Next doesn't support that and no server that I know of supports that. But I think it's super exciting, although it does bring up the issue of cascading, which is the architectural footgun that I talked about at the very beginning of this issue. And that's what we're going to get into right now. Okay, so what is a cascade outside of a particularly gorgeous area of the Pacific Northwest? So a cascade is where you have one request that leads into another request and another request and another request. And in between each, you get a rendering cycle. And this is the kind of thing that you want to avoid, particularly on the server side where you really want a single render before the page goes out to the client. So let me try and reproduce this in our current client-side code. All right, so we have our app.jsx, and we have our list of names. And what we're going to do is we're going to do detail on each one of those names. So instead of doing the button to load it, we're just going to call that detail. We can get rid of our set selected and all that. And then we'll add the ID. Cool. And there we go. There's all of our data. How cool is that? But if we go and put a console in here, and we can start to see that we're rendering data with 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we go and look in the detail, and we go and add in a rendering there, rendering detail with the ID. What matters is the ordering. So let's take a look over here at the console and hit refresh. What we can see is we're getting a lot of gray in here, and that's because we're actually in React 18's strict mode. So let's remove that so maybe we can get a clearer picture of what's going on. So remove strict mode. And what we get is we get a waterfall of requests. So we get the ID first, and then we get the subsequent 1, 2, 3, 4. That's kind of unavoidable given the fact that we have this API that works this way, but we also get this cascade of renders, and that wouldn't be very good on the server side. It's kind of fine here on the client, but even then, not great. So what are some ways around this? Well, the big way around this is to do what Next does, which is to put all of the data fetching preloaded and then just pass it out to the components that need it. And that data preloading is get server-side props. And that's why you don't run into this issue of multiple rendering passes in Next.js. You get all that data up front, and then you just pass it around via props. What we could do here is we could be a little bit smarter about it. We could actually preload all the data first and then get one rendering pass out of it. Let's go and see if we can make that happen. Okay, so down here, before we load this name, so let's actually go and bring in useState and useEffect again. And I'm going to create some state that says whether or not we're initialized, meaning that we've preloaded all the data. And we'll set that to false to start. And now we will only render names if we are initialized. But we're not, so we're not going to render names. So now we need to go and do the preload. So let's do that with the useEffect. And in here, we're going to create an async function and then call it. And in that async function, we are going to go get our initial list of IDs. And then we'll await that. And then we'll await getting all of the subsequent data. So we're going to go and map through the data, get each ID, and then do a promise.all to make sure that all of those are loaded before we say that we are initialized, which is the last thing we do here. And there we go, a single rendering pass where we get all of the rendering done because we have waited to render any of those components until we have everything already preloaded in our cache, which is effectively the same thing as you'd have if you did a get server-side props. The value here is that at the component level, say over here in detail, we don't actually care if we are getting it as required by doing cache fetch right here. If the cache is emptied, then we just go and get it at that point. If the cache is actually filled, which it is in our case because we preloaded it, then it just gets the preloaded version of the cached item. So this cascade is the kind of thing that you run into when you build out smart components like this. Components that just go and grab data on their own, and you don't know up front all of the requests that are going to be used to populate the page. And so you run into these issues where you are doing lots of renders and lots of requests. And so you need to try and figure out, if you're going to use that model, can you preload all of those requests so that the components still think they're smart, like our details component here, but what they're actually doing is loading out of a cache instead. Either that, or just go back to the Next.js model, where you're just, the page knows exactly what data it needs, and it goes, it gets that in the server-side props fetch or the static rendering stuff, and then it just passes that off as props to those components, that's also a fine and acceptable way to go. What you don't want to do is get into having each component go and get its own data and you not having any idea about how many requests are going to be on the page before the page actually renders. All right, well, I hope this video helps you understand a little bit more about this RFC and why it's such a cool thing in the React community and why everyone's so excited about it and how it impacts the client and the server and how to avoid some tactical gotchas like calling fetch in the use itself, or strategic gotchas like avoiding this cascading and waterfall behavior that adds to a lot of re-render and slow performance. Of course, in the meantime, if you like this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you really like the video, be sure to hit that subscribe button and click on that bell and be notified the next time a new Blue Collar Coder comes out.